Purple. Hardly any other color evokes such strong images: delicate chocolate, Alpine idyls, childhood memories, and of course, the purple cow. For many, Milka is not just a sweet treat, but a piece of German cultural heritage, firmly rooted in everyday life for over 120 years, so much so that reaching for it on the supermarket shelf feels almost like a reflex. But how real is this promise actually? And what really lies behind the purple facade? In this film, we'll show you why Milka is far less idyllic than the advertising promises, and how behind the sweet chocolate lies a bitter truth that hardly anyone knows. To understand the brilliance of this marketing, we have to look deep into its history. The brand's roots go back to the Swiss chocolatier Philippe Souchard. Born in 1797 and died in 1884, he was a true pioneer of the 19th century. He spent years experimenting to transform chocolate, which at the time was a bitter, coarse luxury product, into a delicate sweet treat. His major technical breakthrough was the invention of the mélangeur, a machine that ground sugar and cocoa mass finer than ever before. But Souchard was not just a technician, he was also a marketing genius. Even during his lifetime, long before the Milka brand, he used the color purple for his packaging, a revolutionary move. At a time when products were usually sold in plain paper, this bold color was a statement. Purple was an expensive, rare color at the time, associated with nobility and exclusivity, and Souchard skillfully transferred this image to his chocolate. After his death, his successors built upon this legacy. In 1901, they registered the Milka brand, a portmanteau of milk and cocoa, and made the purple color the definitive trademark. Over the decades, the brand changed owners several times until it eventually became part of the global food corporation Mondelez. And it is precisely this corporation that now determines how Milka is produced and marketed. The heart of the Milka brand, its foundation, is the promise of 100% Alpine milk. When we hear that, images immediately come to mind. A small herd of cows grazing on a blooming mountain meadow, bells ringing, and in the background, majestic peaks rise into the sky. Pure nature. This is exactly the image that the parent company Mondelez wants to plant in our minds. But what does Alpine milk really mean? The definition is first of all purely geographical. The milk comes from a clearly defined Alpine region that stretches across Germany, Austria, and northern Italy. That sounds good and exclusive at first, but the crucial question isn't where the milk comes from, but how the cows are kept. The idyllic image of the mountain meadow usually has little to do with the reality of modern dairy farming. An average dairy farm in the Alpine region today has around 50 to 60 cows, so it's not an idyllic scene with 3 cows in the barn, but rather conventional agriculture. This often means high-performance cows of the Holstein Friesian breed, which are bred for maximum milk production. And the feed is not just Alpine herbs, but often consists of purchased concentrated feed, which frequently contains soy from overseas. Critics have seen this approach for years as a prime example of greenwashing and misleading advertising. It is repeatedly criticized that an industrial mass product is artificially imbued with an image of nature, sustainability, and small-scale farming origins, which it cannot actually fulfill in reality. Media reports point out that terms like Alpine milk deliberately evoke romantic notions in consumers, of cows spending their lives on lush pastures and of milk that is supposedly of higher quality. However, the company does not provide any evidence that the housing conditions or the quality of the milk actually differ significantly from those of conventional farms. Commentators have referred to this in this context as an outright advertising lie. The cow is purple, the company's vest is supposed to be white, but the reality is often gray. At its core, the criticism is Mondelez exploits people's deep-rooted longing for nature and authenticity in order to better sell a standardized industrial product. The purple cow, invented in 1972 by the advertising agency Young and Rubicam, was a brilliant marketing coup, one of the most successful advertising characters in the world. But that's exactly what it is: a fiction. A purple coat of paint for a gray industrial hall, distracting us from thinking about the reality of mass production. Alpine milk quickly became the central selling point because it suggested purity, quality, and untouched nature, a strong contrast to the emerging, often dirty industrialization of the early 20th century. This principle, over 100 years old, was later perfected and taken to the extreme by the corporations that inherited Suchard's legacy. The invention of the purple cow was the absolute pinnacle of this strategy, a masterpiece of advertising psychology. The idea was to bundle the abstract positive associations of milk and nature into a concrete, unforgettable figure. This cow became the star of countless commercials. She went skiing, relaxed by the mountain lake, and was always friendly, gentle, and a little naive. The perfect canvas for the longing for an ideal world. The success was so immense that in the 1990s, media reported that many children actually believed cows were purple. This is no coincidence, but the result of cold-blooded advertising psychology deliberately targeting the youngest. Children are not yet able to critically question advertising. A friendly, colorful cartoon character like the purple cow creates a deep emotional connection and trust. This phenomenon, also known as early childhood brand imprinting, is worth its weight in gold for corporations. It anchors the brand positively in long-term memory and creates customers for life. The emotional foundation laid in childhood often overrides any rational consideration of ingredients or price as an adult. In fact, consumer protection organizations like Foodwatch and the Consumer Advice Centers have repeatedly criticized Milka, although mostly in a different context: the issue of shrinkflation. In 2025, the Milka Alpine Milk Bar received the negative award Goldener Windbeutel because its content shrank from 100 to 90 grams, while the price increased from €1.49 to €1.99. A hidden price increase of almost 50%. The Hamburg Consumer Center also documented several times that Milka packages became smaller, or that products like Tender and Röllchen suddenly contained one portion less. In this context, Foodwatch accused Mondelez of misleading consumers and criticized the fact that the new gram amounts were often hard to see, since they were placed in small print on the front and were covered by cardboard flaps on the supermarket shelf. So we've seen that the purple cow and the Alpine milk promise are mainly marketing. But the real trick happens somewhere else entirely. We enter the laboratory of the food industry, and what happens here is anything but sweet. Here, the primary goal is not to create the most nutritious or natural product possible. The aim is to construct a product using the cheapest possible ingredients that maximally stimulates our senses and triggers an irresistible craving. The goal is to perfect the so-called bliss point, the point of maximum pleasure, a term coined by food technologists for the precise blend of sugar, fat, and texture that directly targets the reward center in our brain, releases dopamine, and tells us more of that. So let's take a classic bar of Milka Alpine milk chocolate and see what we're actually eating. The list of ingredients is short but revealing. The most important ingredient for the bliss point is sugar, and that's over 50%. A 100-gram bar contains over 50 grams of sugar. To put that into perspective, that's about 17 sugar cubes. The World Health Organization recommends a maximum intake of 25 grams of free sugar per day for adults to prevent health problems. With just one bar of Milka, we consume twice the recommended daily dose. But it's not just the amount. The sugar is ground so finely and dissolved in the fat matrix that it melts instantly on the tongue and immediately floods the reward system. This creates a brief high, but inevitably a drop in blood sugar follows, making us tired and triggering cravings for the next sugar rush. A vicious cycle. But sugar is only half the story. The real trick that made Milka world famous lies in the fat, and that's where things get interesting. So the second crucial ingredient is the fat. And this is exactly where the secret behind the famous delicate melt lies. In real premium chocolate, cocoa butter is responsible for this. It has a melting point that is precisely matched to our body temperature. That's why it immediately dissolves on the tongue, a luxury you can feel instantly. But cocoa butter is expensive. That's why in the classic Milka Alpine milk bar, anhydrous milk fat is also used. Cheaper than pure cocoa butter, but still effective in terms of sensory experience. In many other Milka products, especially the filled varieties, palm oil also comes into play. It can be processed industrially to mimic almost any desired melting point. Together with emulsifiers like soy lecithin, a kind of invisible glue between fat and water, this creates an artificially perfected system. The result appears sophisticated, but in reality it is above all one thing, a cost-effective imitation of the original. The seemingly harmless trick with the fat leads us directly to the real cost, the cocoa. Here is where the true price of chocolate becomes apparent. Behind every bar of Milka lies a supply chain that has nothing to do with Alpine idylls, but rather with harsh reality, poverty, exploitation, and sustainability seals that often promise more than they deliver. A closer look reveals just how big the differences really are. Cocoa Life versus fair trade. Mondelez prides itself on its own sustainability program, Cocoa Life, which is prominently displayed on many packages and is meant to give consumers a clear conscience. But let's not be fooled. Fair trade guarantees farmers a minimum price and an extra premium, which they decide on democratically, money for schools, wells, or better farming methods. With Cocoa Life, there is no minimum price. Farmers are at the mercy of the brutal fluctuations of the world market. Fair trade prohibits child labor and has compliance monitored by independent inspectors. Cocoa Life points to training programs but without external oversight. The reality in West Africa is harsh. Over 1.5 million children work there in cocoa farming, using machetes, carrying heavy loads, and handling pesticides instead of going to school. And while fair trade is independent, with Cocoa Life everything is in the hands of the corporation, client, financier, and inspector all at once. Critics call it a marketing label that looks good but does nothing to change poverty. Reports show many farmers live on less than $2 a day. Some of them even say they've never tasted a bar of chocolate, the very product they've spent their lives working for. But the problems with the ingredients go far beyond unfair supply chains. They affect us directly. Milka is not just a sweet treat, but a classic example of a highly processed food, what experts call ultra-processed food. These are industrially manufactured products that have little to do with their original ingredients. They are designed in the lab to create exactly the flavor combination that gives our brains the greatest reward, using an unnatural mix of sugar, fat, flavorings, and emulsifiers. Meanwhile, important nutrients like fiber, vitamins, and minerals are removed or destroyed during processing. What remains are empty calories. The body receives plenty of energy, but hardly any valuable building blocks it needs for its functions. Health organizations like the WHO have been warning for years about the consequences of high consumption of such products. Studies suggest that they not only increase the risk of obesity and type 2 diabetes, but may also be linked to other lifestyle diseases. The quick sugar rush and the artificially created creamy melt also lead to an almost addictive behavior. The brain's reward system is stimulated in the short term, which keeps making us reach for the purple bar again and again. Earlier, we talked about shrinkflation, and now we come to an even bolder phenomenon, the so-called greedflation. Perhaps the cheekiest trick doesn't take place on the cow pasture or in the lab, but in the balance sheets. Here, we can see how Mondelez made profits right in the middle of the crisis, while we paid more than ever before. Of course, the costs for raw materials like cocoa, sugar, and energy have risen sharply in recent years. Corporations like Mondelez are happy to cite this and do so with great media attention as the reason for their obvious price increases. But critics accuse them of using general inflation fears and disrupted supply chains as a pretext to raise prices far beyond the actual increases in costs, massively boosting their profit margins at the expense of consumers. Let's take a look at the facts. In the 2023 fiscal year, Mondelez International reported revenues of over $36 billion, an increase of almost 15% compared to the previous year. Profits amounted to several billion, and this happened at a time when German consumers were struggling with the highest food inflation in decades. So while many people in the supermarket were wondering whether they could even afford chocolate anymore, Mondelez was posting record numbers. To observers, this seems like more than just passing on increased costs. The suspicion, prices were deliberately used to increase margins. The strategy behind this is deeply rooted in behavioral psychology. Studies show that consumers react much more sensitively to a direct price increase than to a reduction in package size. Our brains are trained to compare price tags, but not to constantly check the fine print for the weight in grams. Mondelez deliberately exploits this cognitive weakness. It's not a mistake, it's calculated. And this calculation goes even further. Mondelez is not just Milka. The corporation is a giant, a so-called big food player. Its portfolio includes brands like Oreo, Toblerone, Philadelphia, TUC, and Dime. When you stand in the supermarket and think you have a choice between different brands, a large part of them actually belong to the same company in the end. This market power allows corporations like Mondelez to dictate prices and put pressure on retailers. The competition we perceive as consumers is often just an illusion. After examining the global economic and health issues, one very practical question remains: what actually happens when the chocolate is all eaten? What remains is the iconic purple packaging, and that is an environmental problem in itself. At first glance, it looks like simple plastic, but in reality, it is usually a highly complex composite package. It consists of several ultra-thin layers, typically plastic such as polypropylene and aluminum. This aluminum layer is excellent at protecting the product from light and oxygen and keeping it fresh. But it is a nightmare for any recycling system. In sorting facilities, these tightly bonded materials can hardly be separated cleanly, if at all. The result? A large portion of this packaging cannot be recycled and instead ends up in waste incineration. The energy and resource-intensive production of aluminum and plastic is thus carried out for a purely disposable product. The promise of recyclability, often suggested by symbols on the packaging, often turns out to be an empty shell in practice. This is how the purple icon becomes a purple avalanche of waste. Time for the conclusion. Milka's marketing sells us an Alpine fairy tale, a romantic fiction that has little to do with the reality of industrial agriculture and food production. The ingredients are a carefully constructed kit designed to hit our bliss point with the cheapest possible components, while the true costs for the environment and people are hidden in global supply chains, concealed by an in-house sustainability label that does not withstand independent scrutiny. Media reports describe how psychological tricks are used in pricing to mislead consumers while simultaneously increasing the profitability of a global mega-corporation that uses inflation as a pretext for higher profits. In the end, the purple cow is what it has always been: a brilliant advertising figure, a masterpiece of marketing.